Before she walked through that heavy wooden door of my shop, bringing in this sharp scent of autumn rain and city wind with her, I just didn't believe in fate. I was just a guy living a painfully ordinary existence, mostly surrounded by settled dust and oiled brass. I was completely, absolutely convinced that my story had already been written, and honestly that it was going to be an exceptionally quiet, unremarkable one.
I was 28 years old when I finally met the woman who made me believe destiny was actually real. Up until that very moment, my days just kind of bled into one another. I didn't really mind it, to be honest. It felt safe. But looking back now, it was just a long, endless stretch of unbroken gray. A life lived entirely in the shadows of other people's vibrant stories.
I worked these really long, solitary hours repairing old, forgotten watches. My shop was tiny. It was tucked away almost invisibly between this bustling bakery and a really quiet bookstore. I'd just sit at my workbench in the back, with a magnifying loupe pressed tight to my right eye, and I'd just watch these blurry shapes of people hurrying past the frosted glass in my front window. They were all out there, living their loud, chaotic lives. But inside my shop, the air was perfectly still. Every single day was exactly the same as the one before it. Tick, tick, tick. That was literally the unending, kind of suffocating soundtrack of my life. Just this constant, steady, mechanical rhythm of tiny gears and tensioned springs. Time passed, right? It was constantly moving forward, marching on second by second, hour by hour, but absolutely nothing in my world ever actually changed. It was just the endless turning of the hands. And then came this one rainy Thursday afternoon. The little brass bell above the door chimed, cutting right through the silence, and there she was. She was carrying this antique pocket watch, heavy and tarnished, that had belonged to her grandfather. She stepped right up to my counter, water literally dripping from the hem of her yellow coat, and as she placed the watch on the glass, she just smiled. "I know this is probably impossible to fix," she said so softly. And that smile, God, I can still see it so clearly. I felt it right in my chest. It felt exactly like sudden sunlight breaking violently through years of cloudy skies. So I took that pocket watch back to my bench, and I ended up spending 3 agonizing hours repairing this incredibly simple mechanism that should have taken me 20 minutes tops. Not because it was difficult, no, just because I desperately wanted an excuse to keep her standing there, just to hear her voice a little bit longer. When I finally handed it back, she looked at me and asked if I wanted to grab a cup of coffee. I swear I nearly dropped the watch right on the wooden floor. That afternoon, coffee turned into a really hearty dinner. Dinner turned into a long, meandering walk. And that walk turned into hours of talking beneath these flickering street lamps until neither of us even realized the city had gone completely quiet and it was almost 2 in the morning. The thing is, we couldn't have been more different. Emma was everything I wasn't. She fiercely loved adventure. I fiercely clung to my routine. She chased sunrises, practically dragging me out of bed. I slept heavily through the mornings, hiding under the pillows. She truly believed that every single stranger on the street had a story worth hearing. And me? I believed most people just wanted to be left alone in the quiet. Yet somehow, against all earthly reason and logic, we just fit together perfectly. Those months easily melted into years, weaving this beautiful, incredibly chaotic life together. We traveled to these loud, crowded places I never ever would have survived alone. We danced terribly in our cramped little kitchen, our socks slipping all over the cheap linoleum floor. We'd argue passionately over which movie to watch on a Friday night, which almost always ended in laughter. She always stole the heavy blankets in the middle of those freezing winter nights, and I'd always pretend to be annoyed by it as I pulled them back. Every tiny habit, every little human flaw, it just became another reason to love her even more. I remember one evening so clearly. We were sitting beside this quiet, glassy lake, just watching the water ripple as the sun went down, painting the whole sky in these bruises of purple and orange. She rested her head right on my shoulder. The air was entirely still, and then she just whispered, "If one day I disappear..."
Don't say that. I interrupted her immediately. This sudden, sharp tightness just gripped my chest, like this cold spike of panic out of absolutely nowhere. Don't say that, I told her again, wrapping my arms so much tighter around her shoulders, pulling her right against me. She just gave this soft, light laugh. The kind that vibrated warmly right against my shoulder. She looked up at me, the fading light catching in her eyes, and they were completely earnest. She just looked at me and said, "I'm serious." I sighed, finally letting the tension go, and rested my cheek heavily against her hair.
I'd spend the rest of my life looking for you, I said. And it wasn't poetry, okay? It was just an undeniable fact. I meant every single syllable of it with my entire soul. She kissed my forehead and whispered, I knew you'd say that. I proposed 3 months later. She was crying before I even managed to fully open the little velvet ring box. Our wedding wasn't expensive. It certainly wasn't glamorous, but to us, it was absolute perfection. Just close friends, family, the sharp smell of cheap champagne and loud laughter echoing in this small rented community hall, and promises that we truly, deeply believed we would keep forever. Then, 5 years later, Emma stood in our kitchen holding this little plastic stick and told me she was pregnant. I have never cried so hard in my entire life. We spent weeks covered in pastel paint, decorating the tiny nursery down the hall. We spent evenings arguing playfully over baby names, writing endless lists on the fridge. We spent our nights just lying there in the dark, dreaming out loud about birthdays and messy school plays and chaotic Christmas mornings, just this beautiful future that suddenly felt completely endless. My chest would physically ache with how full it was. Everything was finally, perfectly, exactly where it belonged. Until a single piercing ringtone shattered the glass. I was sitting at my bench in the shop, the magnifying glass pressed firmly to my eye, delicate tweezers in my hand adjusting the hairspring of a customer's watch, when my phone buzzed violently against the wood. An unknown number. It was a police officer.
He told me there had been an accident. That was the exact moment time stopped, minute 0. 5 minutes later, the officer's voice crackled through the speaker, explaining that a truck had crossed the median. Emma's car. After that, I just stopped hearing words entirely. The next hour was a complete blur of time. It was absolute chaos. Just forcing my numb legs to carry me through the sliding doors at the hospital, doctors running frantically down these bright white hallways, machines beeping in a rhythm I couldn't even understand, people shouting urgent orders, and then, hour 3. Someone grabbed my shoulder. Someone else murmured they were sorry.
Hours later, a surgeon walked slowly toward me in the quiet waiting room. The overhead lights just hummed. He had tears in his own eyes. He told me they performed an emergency delivery. They saved the baby, but Emma didn't survive the trauma. My son lived, but my wife was gone. The very last thing she ever said to me that morning, standing right there by the front door with her car keys dangling from her fingers, adjusting her scarf, was, "Don't forget to buy milk." I laughed. She laughed. It was so incredibly ordinary, just another mundane Thursday task. Neither of us had any earthly idea that it would be our goodbye forever. Later that afternoon, in a quiet, sterile hospital room, I held the warm, fragile weight of my newborn son against my chest for the very first time, while a nurse, with this sympathetic gaze, handed me a cold plastic pen to sign the preliminary release papers for my wife's funeral. My happiest day, instantly, brutally, became the absolute worst day of my life. 4 days. That's all it took to go from a life with her to a life without. The church was just this absolute blur of faces. Friends, family, sure, but also so many people Emma had quietly helped over the years. The florist she always bought from, the older lady whose groceries she'd carry every Tuesday, even the barista who knew her exact coffee order. I literally had no idea how many lives she touched until they all showed up to say goodbye. And through all the speeches and the poetry she loved, I just stood there, holding our newborn son. He'd never even heard his mother's voice. And honestly, that thought just broke something deep inside me. When everyone else finally cleared out, I just stayed. The cemetery was deafeningly silent. I knelt down right beside the fresh dirt of her grave, and I just whispered into the emptiness, "I'm sorry, I am so sorry I couldn't save you." And right then the wind shifted. It carried this really distinct scent of rain. For just one fleeting, agonizing second, it felt exactly like she was standing right beside me. But then, reality kind of snapped back. I drove back to a house that really wasn't a home anymore. It was more like a museum of a future that just wasn't going to happen. Her shoes by the door, the cloud-painted nursery upstairs. My son started to cry. And as I held him in the crushing silence of that living room, the absolute weight of doing this whole thing without her hit me all at once. I looked around the empty room and just admitted it out loud. I don't know what I'm doing, but I knew his mom believed I could do this. So I had to try. I gave him his name right then, Noah. It was the name Emma had actually circled 3 times in our baby name book. So yeah, she won that argument before she even knew it.
It was my quiet promise to her, really. A promise to just keep going.
Look, I won't lie to you, that first year wasn't living. It was purely survival. Just a grueling blur of zero sleep, endless bottle feedings, and doctor checkups. But then came the milestones. The first smiles, the first laughs. Every single one was incredibly beautiful, but man, they hurt like a physical pain. Because whenever Noah laughed, I heard Emma. Whenever he smiled, I saw her. Sometimes he'd tilt his head exactly the way she used to, and I would literally have to walk out of the room just so he wouldn't see me crying.
As Noah got older, the inevitable questions started. "Dad?" he'd say. "Where's Mom?" The very first time he asked me that, he was only 4 years old. I swear I felt the blood completely drain from my face. I just froze. I looked up at this photo of her we had hanging in the hallway from the day I proposed, and I gently pulled him onto my lap. "Your mom loved you more than anything," I told him. "But where is she?" he asked again. I swallowed hard. The lump in my throat felt like shattered glass. I knew I had to give him the gentle but totally blunt truth. "She's gone, buddy." "Will she come back?" he asked with that wide-eyed, innocent hope. No. He just looked at me, so confused. Then, how does she know I miss her? And I just broke. I literally had no answer for him. I couldn't get a single word out. I just hugged him super tight, holding him against my chest in silence until he finally fell asleep on my shoulder. Later that night, sitting all alone in the dark, I broke down and cried harder than I had since the day of her funeral.
The thing about time is, it really doesn't wait for your grief to end. Years passed. And as they did, I got to watch with this quiet, overwhelming pride as Noah grew into exactly the kind of person Emma would have adored. He was so kind, so curious. He was the kid always noticing the lonely people, you know? If someone dropped something, he was already there picking it up.
I remember one afternoon, his teacher pulled me aside after school. She said, "You should know, your son spends every single lunch sitting with a boy whose mother recently passed away." He told me, nobody should eat alone after losing someone. My chest tightened up so hard I could barely breathe. That was exactly what Emma used to say. No one heals by themselves. And standing there in that hallway for the first time in years, I actually smiled without an ounce of guilt, because I knew her empathy was absolutely living on in him.
Fast forward a bit. When Noah turned 16, we took a drive out to the lake where I'd proposed to his mom. He was taller than me by this point, skipping stones across the water. We were just standing there on the edge in this really comfortable silence.
"Dad?" he asked suddenly. "Yeah? Were you ever angry at Mom for leaving?" Man, that question completely caught me off guard. I looked over at him, studying his face. "No," I said softly. "But she left," he pushed back. "She didn't choose to," I explained. He nodded slowly. "I think I understand." We stood there in this heavy silence, just listening to the water. And then he reached into his backpack.
"I found something," he said. He handed me this small, dusty envelope. The second I saw the handwriting on the front, this physical shock just hit my entire body. My hands literally started shaking. He explained that it had slipped way down behind her old desk years ago. I carefully opened it up. I unfolded the paper and just started reading her words out loud. "If you're reading this, then life didn't go the way we hoped. I know you. You're blaming yourself. Please don't. If we have a child, promise me you'll tell them stories about me. Don't make me perfect. Tell them I burned pancakes. Tell them I cried during silly movies. Tell them I couldn't keep houseplants alive. Tell them I laughed too loudly. Let them know I was human." It was her voice, reaching out across time, begging me not to put her on a pedestal and to stop carrying the blame for something I couldn't control. I kept reading, my voice cracking pretty much on every single word. Most importantly, don't stop living, because I stopped breathing. Fall in love with sunsets again. Laugh until your stomach hurts. Dance badly in the kitchen. And if one day someone else makes you smile, don't feel guilty. Love is not something that runs out. The love we shared will always be yours, forever. Emma. By the time I finished reading, both Noah and I were just a mess of tears. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me in this massive hug. "I wish I could have met her," he whispered into my shoulder. I pulled back just enough to look him right in the eyes, smiling through the tears. "You did," I told him. He looked a bit confused. "Every time you choose kindness," I explained. "Every time you help someone out, every time you make me laugh, I meet her all over again." The years kept moving, as they do. Eventually, the day finally arrived for Noah to graduate from university.
It was this perfect, warm spring afternoon. And as thousands of people cheered and applauded, I stood up, clapping so hard and for so long that my hands literally stung.
But right beside me, on the folding chair to my left, there was just this one single white rose resting on an empty seat. People walking by probably thought I was saving it for someone running late. But I knew. Deep down in my bones, I knew that seat had always been hers.
Once the ceremony wrapped up, Noah made his way over to me through the crowd. He looked at me, holding his diploma with this huge, triumphant smile, and said, "We did it, Dad."
I looked up at the sky for a second, just feeling the warm sun on my face. No, I corrected him gently. We did it. And I kid you not, right at that exact moment, this sudden, gentle breeze blew through the trees around us, and on that breeze was the unmistakable exact scent of rain from the very day I first met Emma. I closed my eyes, and I swear, in my heart, I could hear her laughing again.
Look, time undoubtedly robbed us of the future we had so carefully planned out. It stole birthdays, anniversaries, those quiet mornings just drinking coffee together. But in that moment, I realized something huge. It could never, ever erase what we built. Because some love stories, they just refuse to end when someone dies. They keep going. They continue in every lesson left behind, in every small act of kindness, in every memory shared, and especially in the child who carries their light out into the whole world.
A long time ago, Emma had playfully asked me what I would do if she just disappeared one day. I told her with absolute certainty that I would spend the rest of my life looking for her. But standing there at my son's graduation, surrounded by this profound sense of peace, the real truth hit me. I never had to look for her. She had been right here with us the entire time.
She was alive in Noah's smile. She was in the empathy he showed to strangers. And she was in the steady, relentless march of every single passing second. Kind of like the old watches I still fixed up at my workbench.
The antique clocks in my shop, they still tick. Time just keeps moving forward, completely indifferent to the shattered pieces it leaves behind in its wake. It really makes you realize how terrifyingly fragile all of this is, how it can all just vanish between one heartbeat and the next. It makes you wonder, if tomorrow never comes, what is the last thing you will have said to the ones you love?